Tonight, we will explore something deeply fascinating: the state of mental health in medieval times. What did it mean to feel anxious, depressed, or simply off in an era when therapy was not an option offered by the local guild? So, as we begin, please find a comfortable position. You may wish to dim the lights and let the soft sounds around you create a gentle background hum. As we ease into our journey together, let's start with the fundamental beliefs of the time. In medieval Europe, it was thought that one's mental health, moods, energy, thoughts, and even the tendency to cry over burnt porridge were all controlled by a mixture of internal fluids. These were not metaphorical concepts. They were believed to be literal bodily juices, and it is likely that someone, somewhere, probably attempted to measure them. This ancient system came from the Greeks, specifically from Hippocrates and Galen, and it persisted for centuries longer than it had any right to. The theory of the four humors claimed that a person's health, personality, and mood were all controlled by the balance of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each of these fluids was tied to a particular personality type. An excess of blood meant you were cheerful and energetic, at least until you became annoying, at which point they might bleed you with leeches. Too much yellow bile made a person angry and impulsive, a great quality for battle but not so good for dinner parties. Black bile was associated with melancholy, what we might now call depression. Back then, it was seen as a mood imbalance caused by cold and dry conditions and too much time spent sitting around thinking. And phlegm? That was associated with those who were slow, calm, or perhaps just tired. So, if you were feeling sad, it was believed you did not need therapy. You needed a bucket and someone with a knife. The preferred cure for emotional distress was bloodletting, a procedure where a vein was opened in the hope that it would make you feel better before you passed out. If that did not work, you might be prescribed laxatives, based on the belief that when your soul hurt, the problem must be in your bowels. Physicians of the time, and we use that word generously here, would diagnose you by asking probing questions like, "Do you feel moist or dry today?" They might examine your urine, consult the stars, or smell your breath. The conclusion was always the same. It was the humors. You were either too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or simply too difficult to treat without some form of divine intervention. It is worth remembering that these were not fringe beliefs. This was mainstream medicine for centuries. So, when you imagine a medieval person having a panic attack, do not picture a concerned friend offering them a cup of tea. Instead, picture a man in a robe, holding a chart of fluids and a very sharp knife, saying, "Let's drain the sadness out." In medieval Europe, if you felt unwell, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually, and you could not blame it on sin, demons, or your neighbor's peculiar bread, there was another obvious culprit: the moon. That bright, glowing orb in the sky was believed to have a direct influence on your mental state. The term, lunatic, did not come out of nowhere. It originates from luna, the Latin word for moon. People genuinely believed that too much exposure to moonlight could scramble your brain like an undercooked egg. This was not just a folk belief. It was widely accepted by doctors, clergy, philosophers, and even the person yelling near the well. The idea was that the moon, being a celestial body with its own feelings, could interfere with your bodily fluids, especially your brain fluids, which were assumed to slosh around your skull like a sad soup whenever the full moon was just right. People who acted strangely around the time of a full moon were not considered to be stressed, overwhelmed, or neurodivergent. They were simply thought to be moonstruck. Some were even locked away temporarily until the lunar cycle had passed, which was the medieval healthcare version of waiting it out. The moon was also blamed for epilepsy, insomnia, hallucinations, and basically anything that could not be easily treated with soup, leeches, or prayer. If you were up at night, pacing or crying, they would not ask about your childhood. They would ask about the sky. Even animals were not considered safe. Farmers swore that their sheep acted skittish and their dogs howled differently under a full moon. If your ox kicked over a cart or your pig ran off into the woods, someone was bound to mutter, "The moon is up to something." Of course, there was no science to back any of this up, but in fairness, there was no science to begin with. Most medical texts referenced astrology as casually as we might reference caffeine, and treatments often included not just herbs and dietary changes, but also considerations of planetary alignments. Sometimes it was not madness. It was just bad moon energy. If your mental health took a turn for the worse, say you started weeping into your bread, shouting at trees, or speaking in rhyming couplets, the first person you would consult was not a doctor. It was the local priest. This was because, in the Middle Ages, the mind was considered a spiritual battlefield, and any behavior that fell outside the norm was immediately interpreted through a theological lens. If you were experiencing depression, perhaps you had committed a sin and forgotten about it. If you had anxiety, it was a sure sign that the devil was getting cozy in your soul. Hearing voices, that was a classic demonic Airbnb situation. Priests were essentially the default mental health professionals of the time, except instead of therapy, they offered confession, fasting, and a stern reminder that you were made of dust and should probably act like it. If you showed signs of what we would now call a mental illness, the priest would perform a moral diagnosis. Were you skipping church? Coveting your neighbor's wife? Laughing too much? Yes, that was considered suspicious. If so, your condition might not require herbs. It might require repentance. For more extreme cases, such as hallucinations, mutism, or erratic behavior, the church had more robust tools at its disposal. These included prayer vigils, pilgrimages, and in special cases, minor exorcisms, just to make sure your sadness was not a demon in disguise. One could not be too careful. Even routine emotions were viewed with suspicion. Excessive joy could be seen as vanity, while deep sadness was considered sloth of the soul, also known as aesthesia, which was essentially a form of spiritual depression treated with psalms and guilt. If you were melancholic, you were not seen as being in need of support. You were considered morally slippery and possibly just not trying hard enough. The irony is that many people genuinely found comfort in the church's explanations. In a world without neuroscience, the idea that suffering had some cosmic meaning was oddly reassuring. It gave a sense of structure to the chaos, even if the treatment was a bit heavy on the chanting. Still, if you had a mental health issue in the Middle Ages, your best hope was not for compassion, but for a priest with a decent bedside manner and a low threshold for accusing you of being possessed by a demon. So, let us say you had been hearing voices, having visions, or just talking to your soup a little too fondly. In today's world, you might be offered therapy or at least a recommendation for a wellness podcast. In the Middle Ages, you would get an exorcism. The preferred treatment for many mental disturbances was not medication or rest, but a firm and theatrical spiritual eviction. The logic was simple. If you were acting strangely, it was probably not due to stress or trauma. It was likely Beelzebub making himself at home behind your eyeballs, and he was not paying rent. Exorcisms came in two varieties. The minor kind, which was basically an intense prayer circle with holy water and some muttering, and the major kind, which was more of a live performance with a cast consisting of one very nervous patient, one heavily robed priest, and a backup choir of concerned monks humming in Latin. The rituals varied, but the essential elements remained consistent. Chanting, reading from scripture, making the sign of the cross, using relics, and occasionally yelling things like, "Depart, foul spirit," directly into your face. If you happened to flinch, that was seen as evidence that the exorcism was working. If you did not flinch, they would just chant louder. Some records describe afflicted people being tied down, sprinkled with salt, or forced to drink holy water. Others were made to fast for days beforehand, which, to be fair, could drive anyone to strange behavior. One unfortunate soul reportedly had demons smoked out of his ears using burning sage, frankincense, and what we can only assume was a deep misunderstanding of proper ventilation. And if none of that worked, you were either deemed to be beyond help or were tragically misdiagnosed as simply being naturally wicked. Not all exorcisms were terrifying, though. In many villages, they were communal events where people would gather in the town square to witness a good old-fashioned supernatural showdown. Think of it as medieval spiritual theater. Part religious ritual, part entertainment, and part a starter for neighborhood gossip. But in truth, most people who underwent exorcisms were not evil. They were just overwhelmed, traumatized, neurodivergent, or unlucky enough to have a panic attack near a bishop. Let us say your condition went beyond moody sighs and occasional staring at candles. You might have been weeping for no reason, forgetting your own name on occasion, or spending a bit too long staring philosophically at firewood. In this case, your treatment would not involve ropes or shouting, but rather a lot of praying, possibly while being locked in a room. This was known in some circles as the gentle approach to mental health. You would be told that your condition was spiritual in origin and that it could be overcome through self-reflection, discipline, and, of course, relentless repentance. Essentially, medieval mental health care often boiled down to the question, have you tried feeling bad about it? The logic was that suffering purified the soul, so if you were already suffering mentally, you were clearly halfway there. Monks and nuns, some of whom were genuinely compassionate, while others were just chronically overworked, might guide you through periods of meditative silence, prayer vigils, fasting, and sleeping on uncomfortable surfaces until either the devil left or you forgot what happiness felt like. Some people would voluntarily enter monasteries as a kind of medieval retreat center. These were not quite spas, but more like spiritual timeout chambers. You would get a cell, a Bible, and 8 hours of daily chanting. Occasionally, you would also get stew. Whether this actually helped with mental illness or simply masked it with religious exhaustion is still a matter of debate. And then there were the relics. If you were feeling unwell, you might touch the bone fragment of a saint. If you had trouble sleeping, you might sleep near a vial of a martyr's blood. If you were sad for no reason, that is what the toe of Saint Euphemia was for. The idea was that holiness was contagious, much like kindness or fleas. Now, to be fair, this was the closest thing to compassionate care in many places. Unlike exorcisms or beatings, the prayer-based approach did not usually involve physical injury, just a lot of chanting and being told that your thoughts were problematic. Sometimes, monks genuinely helped people through a sense of community, quietude, and a structured routine. Other times, they would just tell you to fast and hope for divine clarity by sunrise. Let us say your condition had progressed beyond moody sighs and occasional staring at candles. Maybe you had started wandering barefoot through town, mumbling about angels, or loudly debating theology with the barn animals. At that point, the medieval response was not a support group. It was a stone room with one window and no doorknob on your side. This brings us to the monastic cell, or as some historians have delicately put it, protective isolation. These cells were tucked away inside monasteries or churches and were considered a form of mercy, with an emphasis on the word considered. You would not be chained or tortured, hopefully, but you would be firmly encouraged not to leave, sometimes for years. The space was simple. Bare walls, perhaps a straw mat, and if you were lucky, a small window through which food, mostly cold gruel, would be passed twice a day. Human contact was rare because the working theory was that your madness was contagious, either emotionally, spiritually, or atmospherically. You were not entirely forgotten, though. Monks might offer prayers for your soul. Occasionally, a kindly brother might bring you some herbs or read psalms outside your door in a tone that suggested you were not the worst thing they had seen that week. Sometimes, the locked room was not part of a monastery but an actual public institution, the early versions of asylums. These were not common until much later, but a few did exist in medieval Islamic cities and, by the 13th century, in places like London and Paris. The goal of these institutions was to provide shelter, not treatment, and certainly not recovery. Now, to their credit, the medieval mindset was not always cruel. Many people believed that the mentally unwell were closer to the divine, touched by God, or perhaps just walking that fine line between prophecy and peculiar behavior. But practically speaking, locking someone away for their own good was just easier than trying to figure out what to do with them. Families would often beg monasteries to take in their afflicted relatives, promising donations in return. The alternative was trying to explain to the neighbors why Uncle Thaddeus was shouting Latin in the cabbage patch again. If you were a woman in medieval Europe and you found yourself feeling overwhelmed, irritable, or tearful, perhaps after your 11th child or your 3rd husband who had plague breath, congratulations, you were probably diagnosed with hysteria. Now, the word, diagnosed, is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Hysteria was not so much a diagnosis as it was a blanket explanation for, this woman is behaving in a way that makes men uncomfortable. If you were crying too much, it was hysteria. Not crying enough? That was suspicious, and you were possibly a witch. Expressing opinions, ambition, or fatigue? That was definitely a problem with your uterus. The term itself comes from the Greek word hystra, which means womb. The theory, and brace yourself for this, was that a woman's uterus could become unmoored and wander freely about her body, causing trouble wherever it went. Yes, that is right. A rogue, floating womb was blamed for everything from anxiety to chronic sighing. Somewhere in your abdomen, your uterus was just doing laps and ruining your day. The symptoms of hysteria included shortness of breath, nervousness, fainting, emotional outbursts, and, to quote one actual medieval source, too much thought. Truly a devastating condition. The treatments varied. A priest might recommend fasting and prayer. A physician might apply herbs, and in some cases, a rather awkward form of manual stimulation was prescribed to calm the uterus, which would be performed by midwives or, in later centuries, by early gynecologists with a concerning lack of supervision. Marriage was also considered a cure. If a woman was single, she needed a husband to settle her womb. If she was married, then obviously she just needed to be pregnant again. Either way, her mental health was treated with more chores and less rest. And if she continued to act strangely, seeing visions, resisting housework, or having too many thoughts in Latin, things could escalate. Some women were accused of witchcraft because nothing screams mental illness quite like growing herbs and asking questions. But not all was bleak. In some cases, women found support in convents, where the demands of daily life were lighter and emotional distress was seen as a part of the spiritual struggle. Some nuns even wrote about their anguish in ways that sound suspiciously modern, minus all the demon metaphors. Still, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages and you had feelings, your best mental health strategy was simple. Keep it quiet, keep it short, and never, ever talk to your cat in public. In a time when monks prescribed fasting, priests blamed demons, and physicians swore by bleeding your soul out through your ankle, the real MVPs of medieval mental health were the herbalists, often elderly women with gardens, cats, and a suspiciously good intuition. These wise women, who were sometimes called cunning folk, were the unofficial and unlicensed therapists of their day. They did not ask how your humors were feeling. They asked when your troubles started, how you were sleeping, and whether your mother-in-law was bothering you again. Their methods were simple: tea, tinctures, and talking, though the talking part was often disguised as advice about herbs. You would sit in a smoky cottage, surrounded by drying plants, and before long, you would be sipping something made from valerian root and lavender while ranting about your neighbor's pig. It was like therapy, but it also cured warts. Herbalists would treat sadness with calming infusions, and anxiety was soothed with chamomile and balm. If you were really distraught, you might be given mugwort, St. John's wort, or in desperate cases, a stiff dose of poppy extract. They called it a sleep aid, you might call it accidental time travel. Most of these women were not formally educated, but their remedies were rooted in generational knowledge, observation, and something that modern medicine likes to call actually listening to the patient. Unfortunately, this also made them suspicious to everyone else. The church viewed them as threats. After all, they operated outside the religious system, did not quote scripture, and did not insist that every problem came from sin. Some towns quietly appreciated them, while others accused them of witchcraft if they got too popular, too effective, or too confident in public. Still, they were often the only source of comfort for people who were suffering from what we would now call depression, trauma, or just plain old burnout. If you were lucky, your village herbalist knew how to blend calming herbs, light a protective candle, and tell you that no, you were not cursed, you were just tired and underappreciated. Were their treatments perfect? Of course not. Sometimes they would rub onions on your feet. But compared to being locked in a stone room or being yelled at by a monk who was holding a goat's skull, the herbalist's approach was practically a form of holistic luxury. So far, we have covered prayers, isolation, and a charming herbalist with a license issued by no one. But medieval mental health had one more tier of solutions, the truly imaginative ones, the kind that made you wonder if the physician was just winging it based on their dreams and the contents of their pantry. Let us begin with the dead owl treatment. If you were plagued by sadness or excessive thoughts, one popular remedy was to tie a dead owl to your head. It was believed that the owl, being a symbol of wisdom, would absorb the confusion or melancholy through your scalp. In practice, it mostly just absorbed flies. If you were feeling particularly anxious, you might try powdered emeralds. Yes, jewel dust. Physicians would recommend grinding up actual gemstones and rubbing the sparkly remains on your chest or consuming them in tiny amounts. Not only did this not work, but it was a great way to ruin both your digestive tract and your jewelry collection. Then there were the cures that involved astrology, which were less medical and more like a vibe check from the stars. A patient's mental disturbance might be blamed on Mars being in a bad mood, and the treatment would be to wait until Jupiter looked friendlier. One medieval medical manual suggested wrapping the sufferer in wolf skin during a thunderstorm to scare off the madness. Another recommended whispering into the left ear of a black dog and then letting it run away with your sorrow, like a very sad and very hairy therapy courier. You could also find remedies that involved smoked herbs being stuffed into pigeons, which were then waved near your head. No one is quite sure what this was supposed to do, but it was very aromatic and quite annoying for the pigeon. And if none of that worked, there was always the pilgrimage, the all-purpose medieval solution to everything. You would pack your sandals, grab a staff, and walk hundreds of miles to a holy site. With any luck, you would either find spiritual peace or at least get enough blisters to distract you from your emotional state. These oddball cures remind us that medieval medicine was not entirely malicious, just wildly misinformed, often experimental, and occasionally based on birds. And hey, if nothing else, they gave people hope, which in those days was about as close to Prozac as you could get. Every medieval town, whether big or small, seemed to have that guy. The one who was dressed oddly, who muttered to himself, who sometimes blessed chickens and sometimes cursed puddles, the town madman. And strangely enough, society did not always lock him away or call for holy water. They would just let him be. In an age when mental health was misunderstood at best and feared at worst, this was an oddly progressive approach. People with visible mental illnesses were not always banished. They were often absorbed into daily life, tolerated like unpredictable weather or that one goat who thought he owned the street. The madman or madwoman, though women were sadly more likely to be accused of witchcraft, held a peculiar place in the medieval social order. They were not quite a threat, not quite a joke, and occasionally they were even revered. In some towns, these individuals were seen as being touched by God, or were given a grudging respect for their unpredictability. If they spouted cryptic phrases while staring into the sun, people would either assume it was a divine prophecy or just that it was Wednesday. They were usually given a nickname like Old Will the Wanderer, Mad Meg, or Tomfool. You will notice that these sound suspiciously like pub names, which says a lot about how much people drank while they were pondering madness. These individuals often lived on the fringes of society, sleeping in abandoned mills, on church porches, or even in literal barrels, Diogenes style. The townsfolk would sometimes give them food or shoes, or just a wide berth. Children were told not to stare, which of course meant that they stared constantly. Occasionally, their strange behavior would lead to small acts of charity. A baker might leave out some bread crusts for them, or a blacksmith might repair a bent walking stick. Medieval communities, for all their superstition, could be surprisingly compassionate, especially when guilt and the fear of eternal damnation were good motivators. But if the madman's behavior became too loud, too violent, or too unsettling, people's patience would run out. Then would come the priests, the isolation, or worse. Tolerance had its limits, especially if the afflicted person stopped being amusing and started being inconvenient. In modern times, we understand that depression is a complex condition that involves brain chemistry, life circumstances, and sometimes just terrible Mondays. But in the Middle Ages, if you were feeling persistently low, tired, or as though life were a slow-motion mudslide, congratulations, you were guilty of aestia. Aestia was not seen as a mental health issue. It was classified as a spiritual failure. One of the original deadly sins before sloth eventually stole its thunder and got top billing. Aestia was defined as sadness at divine good, or in more practical terms, spiritual apathy, a lack of joy, and the general medieval version of lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. Monks were especially prone to this condition, which they poetically called the noonday demon. Picture it. A monk who is supposed to be copying psalms, but instead is just staring at a wall, wondering what the point of it all is. In today's world, that would be called burnout. In the 12th century, it was a moral crisis that required an urgent rebuke and possibly more prayer beads. Sufferers of aestia were not offered comfort. They were told to pray harder, work more, and stop being so selfish. Depression was not seen as a condition. It was viewed as laziness with a different brand. If your soul did not feel joy, it was your own fault. Maybe you had not repented hard enough, maybe you were secretly proud, or maybe, and this was the nuclear option, you were letting Satan win. And if you dared to express your sorrow out loud, you were not just pitied, you were seen as being contagious. Sadness could spread. It was like emotional mildew, and the monasteries did not want it soaking into their walls. Lay people were not immune either. If you could not find joy in your toil, it was not because you were exhausted or grieving. It was a sign that you needed to go to confession and maybe build a shed out of guilt. Ironically, some of the writings from monks who battled with aesthesia sound remarkably modern. They include descriptions of numbness, fatigue, restlessness, and even suicidal thoughts. But instead of therapy, they were prescribed fasting and mentally cataloging their sins in alphabetical order. In a time when most people owned 2 shirts, and one of them was infested with fleas, you would think that laughter would be encouraged. A little bit of joy, perhaps a chuckle to get through the plague-filled, mud-splattered, leech-happy nightmare that was daily life. But think again. In medieval Europe, laughter was not always seen as a sign of happiness. It was often considered a moral red flag. Sure, peasants laughed, jesters laughed, and occasionally, even a monk might crack a smile if a goose did something particularly scandalous. But the official stance from theologians, chroniclers, and other very serious people was that laughter could be dangerous, a gateway emotion to chaos, sin, and possibly even dancing. The Church, which was ever watchful of human weakness, warned against excessive mirth. Thomas Aquinas, whose sense of humor was reportedly filed under "to be developed," believed that laughter should be moderate and should serve a higher purpose. Uncontrolled laughter was seen as a sign of a spiritual disorder, and maybe even demonic influence. After all, who laughs without a reason? The answer, of course, is people with a functioning sense of humor. Women, naturally, were doubly judged. A laughing woman was clearly up to something, witchcraft probably, while a solemn, silent woman was seen as appropriately pious or just very dehydrated. And let us not forget the laughter of the mad. If someone laughed at inappropriate times, say, during a funeral or while milking a goat, it was not seen as just being eccentric. It was seen as evidence of a mental illness, possession, or both. Involuntary giggling was basically a red flag with a tambourine. In some religious orders, novices were explicitly forbidden to laugh during meals, prayer, or basically any activity that might spark some human connection. Joy was fine in theory, but it had to be the wholly inward kind, not the belly-aching, wine-snorting kind you get after someone slips on a turnip. Still, people did laugh. Humor survived in village festivals, in satirical poetry, and in that one guy in every town who could make funny noises with his armpits. But it was always a little bit risky. Joy was tolerated, but it was not trusted. In today's world, talking to your cat is considered quirky. In the Middle Ages, it was potentially heretical, mildly alarming, and depending on the tone of your voice, it could be grounds for questioning your sanity or scheduling a light exorcism. You see, medieval society had very clear ideas about who you could and could not have conversations with. People were fine, and priests were even better. But if you started chatting with animals, invisible angels, or anything that did not answer back out loud, eyebrows would be raised, and they were usually followed by torches. Let us start with animals. Cats were already walking a fine line. On the one hand, they controlled pests. On the other, they were sleek, mysterious, and they never went to church. If you confided in your tabby too often, people might assume that she was your familiar, sent by the devil to whisper forbidden wisdom to you about herbal remedies and where your neighbor had hidden his cheese. Birds were also suspect. Medieval bestiaries were full of half-true and very weird facts. If someone said that a crow had told them the future, that was not seen as poetic. It was seen as treason against sanity. Even dogs, mankind's loyal companions, were acceptable until they started appearing in your dreams, wearing robes and quoting scripture. Then there were the angels, who, according to countless religious texts, were everywhere, watching, protecting, and occasionally delivering ominous messages during thunderstorms. If you claimed to see or hear them often, you might be considered saintly, or if your timing was poor, you might be considered mad or possessed. The difference often depended on whether you were in a monastery or yelling at the clouds in the town square. And of course, there were imaginary friends. Children were mostly given a pass. But adults? If you claimed to be speaking with invisible beings who were giving you instructions, the options were limited. You were either a prophet, a lunatic, or a future bonfire decoration. There was not much middle ground. Interestingly, some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, claimed to have vivid visions and conversations with divine figures. And because they were cloistered, educated, and slightly intimidating, they were tolerated. But if you were a peasant named Bertram who talked to squirrels about theology, you probably were not going to be writing any illuminated manuscripts anytime soon. In the medieval world, mental illness teetered between two extremes. Either you were a walking curiosity or a shameful family secret, and often you were both, depending on whether the village market was open. Let us start with the public spectacle. If someone with a visible mental illness wandered through town, muttering to themselves, dancing in the rain, or arguing passionately with a bucket, they might attract attention, but not necessarily scorn. In fact, they could become a fixture of village life, like the bell tower or that one goat that was always escaping. People would watch, whisper, and maybe even laugh. Not out of cruelty, well, not always, but out of a weird blend of amusement and fear. Deep down, everyone was worried that it could be them next week if they got hit on the head or ate some spoiled eel pie. In some places, these individuals were known as natural fools, a term that sounds insulting but was weirdly affectionate by medieval standards. They were seen as innocent, almost childlike, and were sometimes believed to have been touched by God, fate, or just a very unfortunate phase of the moon. You could end up with food, shelter, and a nickname. It was not ideal, but in a world without therapy, it was better than being locked in a tower. But for families, the situation was not so charming. If your relative was struggling quietly, perhaps they were depressed, withdrawn, or plagued by what we would now call anxiety, it was often handled as a private matter, which in medieval terms meant, do not talk about it ever. Shame was a powerful social currency, and having a troubled mind in the household could reflect poorly on the entire lineage. Some families would keep afflicted members hidden, while others would send them off to monasteries or on pilgrimage routes, hoping that a change in divine geography would work where herbal tea had failed. In some sadder cases, people were disowned entirely, especially if they were seen as being disruptive or, worst of all, embarrassing at weddings. Public mental health care barely existed, so shame filled the gap where support systems should have been. There were no clinics, no community outreach programs, just a mix of whispered prayers and pretending that everything was fine. By the end of the Middle Ages, somewhere around the late 15th century, give or take a plague, things began to shift. Not quickly and not gracefully, but if you squinted hard enough, you could spot the early signs of humanity inching its way toward compassion, one confused scholar at a time. For one thing, philosophy and science began to sneak into the conversation, thanks to the Arabic medical texts that had been preserved and translated in places like Spain and Sicily. Western Europe was reintroduced to the ancient Greek thinkers who, while not exactly modern psychologists, had at least considered that the human mind was not just a demonic puppet show. Scholars started to flirt with the idea that madness could stem from imbalances in the body, not just from sins or sorcery. Physicians began to write treatises that discussed melancholy and mania with slightly fewer biblical quotes and slightly more references to anatomy. But do not get too excited. The treatments still involve things like applying a leech to the temple, but at least people were reading. At the same time, the idea of charitable care began to evolve. In cities like Valencia and Cairo, early hospitals started to separate out patients with mental disturbances from the general wards. Some even offered them gardens, music, and conversation. It was still far from being a dignified approach, but it was better than being yelled at by a priest while you were tied to a goat post. The invention of the printing press did not hurt either. With greater access to books, ideas about the mind began to spread faster than syphilis at a midsummer fair. This helped to plant the seeds for the Renaissance, when the perception of mental illness began its long uphill climb from "you are cursed" to "you might need some support." Of course, not everything changed. People still feared what they did not understand, and the line between madness and mysticism remained as thin as a monk's bedsheet. But the groundwork had been laid. Slowly, the mad were no longer seen solely as vessels of sin or divine wrath. In a radical twist, they were beginning to be seen as human, fallible, suffering, and worthy of care. Not hugs, though. That would come centuries later. From the outside, the life of a noble looked divine. It was a world of perfumed corridors, diamond-crusted attire, and servants who waited on every whim. Whether at the Palace of Versailles or within the imperial walls of Kyoto, the nobility projected an illusion of perfection, an elegance that was frozen in time like a portrait. But what the public did not see was the suffocating reality that lay beneath the powdered faces and the rigid etiquette. For many nobles, this life of luxury was less like heaven and more like a velvet-lined prison. Every aspect of a noble's day, from the time they were expected to rise to how they were supposed to fold a napkin, was dictated by unwritten rules or ceremonial codes. In France, nobles were expected to perform the lever ritual each morning, where courtiers would literally line up to watch the king get out of bed. Participation in this ritual was not optional. If you were not seen in the right rooms at the right hours, rumors would spread, your influence would shrink, your enemies would smile, and at Versailles, losing social capital was often deadlier than losing money. Across the world, in Japan, the court nobles in Kyoto faced a different but equally suffocating script. The elite of the Heian period were expected to master poetry, calligraphy, music, and the subtle art of maintaining an aloof expression. Every word, every bow, every movement of a sleeve was a piece of political theater, and a failure to perform correctly meant social suicide. Even leisure was performative. A ball was not just a party, it was a test of alliances. A walk in the garden might be a silent battlefield of glances and veiled insults. You were not simply living your life. You were playing a role in an eternal play where the audience was everyone and the stakes were your legacy. And yet, few nobles ever escaped this life because the very privileges that made them so admired also kept them in chains. Inheritance laws, arranged marriages, debt obligations, and the constant surveillance of their rivals meant that they rarely had any control over their own fates. Behind the closed doors of their manor houses, many nobles experienced mental decline, quiet rebellion, or spiritual despair. But in public, they always smiled. This was the great paradox of noble life. The more prestige you had, the less freedom you possessed. They were born at the top, but they often died without ever having lived for themselves. When you picture a nobleman striding through the Palace of Versailles in silk stockings, or a lady gliding down a staircase in pearls, the last thing you probably imagine is debt collectors. But behind all the glamour, a surprising number of nobles were financially drowning. It turns out that maintaining the illusion of wealth was more expensive than possessing actual wealth itself. At Versailles, appearances were everything. A noble might spend more on a new waistcoat or a ball gown than they would on maintaining an entire estate. Why? Because fashion was a form of currency. If you did not keep up, you would simply vanish, politically, socially, and eventually financially. Courtiers would gamble enormous sums of money, not just at cards, but on horses, land speculation, and high-stakes alliances. Many nobles would mortgage their ancestral estates just to fund one more season of social relevance. And the king did not help matters. Louis XIV, in particular, kept the nobles close not just physically but also economically. He encouraged extravagant spending at court to keep them dependent, distracted, and loyal. A ruined noble was a controllable noble. In England, the aristocracy was not much better off. During the Georgian era, lords and ladies often lived in opulent townhouses in London that were financed entirely on credit. Tailors, wine merchants, and milliners were expected to wait for months, and sometimes even years, for payment. Entire families were balanced on the edge of collapse, hoping that their daughter would marry a wealthier man or that some distant cousin would die and leave them a title and a working estate. Meanwhile, in Russia, the nobles were granted vast lands that were populated by serfs, and yet many of them were still cash poor. Their wealth was illiquid, so their lavish lifestyles in Moscow required constant borrowing. Pawn shops would discreetly handle tiaras and sabers. Family jewels were sold under candlelight behind locked doors. Japan's noble class fared no better. During periods of peace, as the samurai class shifted from being warriors to bureaucrats during the Tokugawa era, many nobles found themselves to be ceremonial but ultimately irrelevant. Their stipends shrank, but their costs remained the same. Some even took on side jobs, yes, actual jobs, in poetry schools or in estate management just to keep up appearances. But admitting to financial hardship was considered a dishonor, so their debts would pile up in secret. The lesson here is that nobility was not about financial stability. It was about the performance of wealth, and often, that performance came at a soul-crushing cost. Scandal was the unofficial second language of the nobility. There were affairs, jewels, secret children, and whispered betrayals. The more polished the public image, the dirtier the private truths. The nobles had power, prestige, and privilege, but what many of them did not have was restraint. At Versailles, the courtiers lived in such close quarters that privacy was nearly non-existent, and yet illicit liaisons flourished. Queen Marie Antoinette was endlessly accused of romantic entanglements, whether with Swedish nobles or with members of her inner circle of ladies. Many of these rumors were false, but they stuck because everyone knew someone who was doing exactly that. The court practically ran on gossip, and scandal was not just tolerated. It was a form of currency. Having your name mentioned in connection with someone else's bedroom could either elevate your influence or ruin your bloodline. Meanwhile, over in England, aristocratic reputations were being shredded in salons and gambling houses. Lord Byron, for example, was rumored to have fathered children with his own half-sister. That did not stop him from being a celebrity, but it did cast a long shadow over his noble status. Nobles were expected to have mistresses, just not too many of them, and definitely not the wrong ones. Affairs with actresses, commoners, or foreign spies could lead to exile, imprisonment, or in rare cases, an early grave. In Imperial Russia, the court of Catherine the Great was notorious for its openness. The Empress herself had lovers throughout her reign, who were often handpicked and elevated to positions of power. But it was not just Catherine. Her courtiers were constantly engaged in intrigues, often mixing political maneuvering with bedroom games. Affairs were less about love and more about leverage. Even in the refined Heian court of Japan, where restraint and poetry reigned, scandal found its way through haikus and love letters. A noblewoman might receive a midnight visitor whose identity she would never reveal, but her next poem, which would be shared among the elite, might offer just enough of a metaphor to ignite a wildfire of speculation. The most dangerous scandals, though, were the ones that never made it into letters or court whispers, the ones that involved treason, espionage, and the betrayal of blood. These were whispered in corridors, documented in coded correspondence, and buried in family archives. In the life of a noble, scandal was not the exception. It was the wallpaper, beautiful, intricate, and always hiding the cracks underneath. For all their earthly power and luxury, the nobles were often tormented by a far less visible force, the crushing weight of spiritual uncertainty. They had everything, and yet they still wrestled with existential dread. Being born into privilege did not grant them any clarity about the afterlife, morality, or their divine purpose. In fact, it often made things worse. In Catholic France, guilt clung to the corridors of the palaces like smoke. The same nobles who attended Mass daily might also indulge in debauchery every night. Confession was a routine practice, but it was often more for social performance than for true penitence. Still, many nobles, especially as they grew older, were haunted by their sins. Some would turn to mystics and visionaries, desperate for answers. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, grew more devout in his final years, racked with fear over his worldly indulgences and the wars he had waged across Europe. The nobles would fund the building of churches and monasteries, not just out of piety, but also as a form of insurance. In their minds, a new chapel might buy them a cleaner conscience, and 1,000 candles lit in their name could offset a lifetime of intrigue and excess. Some would retreat into a monastic life altogether in their old age, swapping their velvet robes for hair shirts. In Orthodox Russia, things were even more intense. The nobles were expected to uphold both the political and the spiritual order, yet many of them wrestled with doubt, especially during the turbulent reigns of the Tsars, who would declare themselves to be chosen by God even as they were ordering purges. Some nobles sought answers in secret prayer circles or turned to the fools for Christ, holy wanderers who had renounced wealth and comfort to speak uncomfortable truths. These odd mystics sometimes served as the only outlet for aristocrats who were facing a spiritual crisis. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, the samurai nobility, a hybrid class, often found themselves torn between Confucian ethics, Shinto rituals, and Buddhist detachment. Some nobles would turn to Zen, hoping that meditation would silence their inner turmoil. Others would compose poetry, not just for the sake of art, but as a form of spiritual catharsis. Still, the tension between duty, honor, and the impermanence of life gnawed at them. When a noble committed seppuku, it was not always about shame. Sometimes it was about achieving a spiritual release. Despite their silks and their titles, the nobles were often profoundly lost. Surrounded by ritual and grandeur, many of them still stared into the void, wondering if any of it truly mattered. Behind the masks of their status, their souls were whispering, and sometimes screaming, for peace. In the age before smartphones and email, the most dangerous thing a noble could send was not an assassin. It was a letter. A simple piece of ink on parchment could undo a dynasty, expose an affair, or spark a revolution. And the nobles, despite their outward elegance, were compulsive correspondents. They wrote everything down: their secrets, their longings, their schemes, their prayers, their loves, and their lies. These were not idle pen-pal exchanges. They were calculated tools of diplomacy and survival. At Versailles, every noble had a paper trail: love letters to their mistresses, pleas to their creditors, and carefully worded flatteries to the king. And not all of it was above board. Couriers would carry sealed notes that were laced with invisible ink or written in cipher. A single wrong phrase in the wrong hands could lead to exile or even the scaffold. Some nobles even had their own personal ciphers, alphabets that were invented solely for their clandestine conversations. The Duke of Orleans, for instance, was known to correspond with suspected radicals in the lead-up to the French Revolution, and his letters were meticulously coded. But ciphers were never foolproof. In one legendary case, a noble's encrypted diary was decoded long after his death, revealing a hidden life of treason and betrayal. In the Habsburg courts, marriage negotiations would often play out through the use of veiled language. A letter might begin with a discussion of the weather and falconry, but it would hide deeper intentions between the lines. Parents would arrange matches through polite lies, and lovers would beg for elopement under the guise of visiting their countryside estates. In Japan's Heian era, poetry served as a form of code. A single waka, which was just 31 syllables long, could convey a message of forbidden love, rejection, or a secret rendezvous. Noble women were particularly skilled at crafting verses with double meanings, and they would often respond in kind within a matter of hours. These exchanges were delivered by discreet messengers, who were sometimes servants or even children, and they were always sworn to silence. During the Renaissance, some noble women ran entire espionage networks through their salons, writing to their allies in foreign courts. In Russia, letters that were smuggled out of the Tsar's inner circle helped to fuel uprisings. Nobles who were trapped in their gilded cages turned to correspondence as their only form of rebellion. Paper became a weapon, a shield, and a confession booth, all in one. Of course, the riskiest letters were the ones that never arrived, those that were intercepted, burned, or buried. Some lay hidden in attics and wall crevices for centuries, their secrets unread and their senders long forgotten. But make no mistake, within those ink-stained lines lived revolutions, heartbreak, and the rawest truths of the noble soul. In noble society, emotion was a luxury that no one could afford. Joy, anger, and fear, all of these feelings were carefully measured, rationed, or concealed entirely. A noble's survival depended not just on their wealth or their title, but on their mastery of the art of emotional camouflage. To rule at court, one had to perform and to never, ever flinch. At Versailles, life was a never-ending theater. The nobles would rehearse their smiles, their bows, and their silences. A raised eyebrow could signal either support or sabotage. Tears were reserved for funerals, and even then, they were only shed if the cameras of courtly judgment were watching. The goal was simple: to project an image of elegance and to hide the chaos. Those who failed were branded as unstable, hysterical, or worse, unfit. This emotional choreography was learned from a young age. Noble children were taught to speak only when they were spoken to display pride without arrogance, and to suppress their grief until it could be written about in their private diaries. Meltdowns were not just embarrassing, they were politically dangerous. A single outburst could be remembered for decades and used as ammunition in future rivalries. In Japan's Heian court, the nobles were even more refined in their restraint. Public displays of emotion were seen as vulgar. One's true feelings were only ever shared through metaphors and poetry, through gestures, or through carefully chosen silences. A noblewoman's sleeve might carry more meaning than her words. A fan that was opened only halfway could signal heartbreak, while a single cherry blossom that was plucked too early could represent despair. To survive, one had to master the art of subtlety as fluently as one mastered language. In England, the nobles kept a stiff upper lip. A scandal could be quietly swallowed with a glass of brandy, but it was never to be spoken of. Behind closed doors, their journals wept for them. There were volumes of sorrow and suppressed rage, bound in leather and sealed away in desk drawers. Mental illness, grief, and shame. All of it was hidden behind ballroom smiles and military posture. Some would crack under the pressure. There are records of nobles who snapped mid-dance or collapsed during ceremonies, who were later confined to asylums or sent away to recuperate in remote estates. But these were whispered tragedies. The show, after all, had to go on. In the grand masquerade of the nobility, emotions were a liability. Masks were not just for balls. They were a part of daily attire. And behind every bow, every compliment, and every elegant laugh, there was often a storm raging, perfectly concealed behind a facade of silk and etiquette. To be born into the nobility was to inherit not just land and titles, but also expectations so heavy that they could crush the spirit. From their very first breath, a noble child was less a person and more a vessel for their family's legacy. Every decision they made was haunted by the demands of their ancestors and the judgment of the generations yet to be born. In France, the sons of dukes and counts were groomed like racehorses. Their futures were mapped out for them in ledgers and family trees. They were to marry this heiress, befriend that prince, and not embarrass their bloodline. Their lives were simply a continuation of a strategy that had been started long before they were ever born, and it was often a strategy that they had no power to alter. Even the women were just pawns on the family chessboard. A duchess's value was often measured by the strength of her dowry and the purity of her lineage. England's aristocracy had similar burdens. The firstborn sons would inherit the estate, the debt, the staff, and the responsibility of ensuring that the family did not fall into disgrace or, even worse, into trade. Those who failed were remembered not for their humanity, but for being the one who lost the manor. Meanwhile, the younger sons, who had no land or title, were quietly funneled into the church or the military, with little choice in the matter. In Russia, noble families carried their status like a ticking time bomb. One misstep, one disagreement with the wrong court faction, and everything could be seized. Their land, their serfs, and even their family name could be revoked. Generations of effort could be wiped away with a single signature. Japan's aristocracy was even more rigid. In the Heian period, noble families would compete for proximity to the emperor. Positions and influence were passed down not through merit, but through lineage. A single disgrace, a failed marriage, or an unruly son could undo centuries of prestige. The pressure to conform was immense, and individuality was often sacrificed on the altar of ancestral duty. And what of those who did not want the title, who did not want to marry a stranger, or to rule an estate, or to bear the family name? Rebellion was not just difficult, it was unthinkable. Some tried, but most were crushed by the machinery of tradition. The burden of inheritance was not just a financial or a political matter, it was a psychological one. A crown of thorns that was worn under a golden halo. To be a noble meant to be chained to a legacy, whether you wanted it or not. Not all nobles followed the script. Beneath the layers of etiquette and the centuries of family pressure, some of them cracked and others resisted. But rebellion among the nobility was not always a dramatic affair. There were no peasant uprisings here, no flaming torches, just quiet, subversive acts that were tucked away into the corners of palaces, hidden behind locked doors or disguised as tradition. At Versailles, where conformity reigned supreme, rebellion took on some strange forms. Some nobles would choose not to attend the king's elaborate morning ritual, a grave offense that was a signal of their independence. Others would dare to wear colors that were out of fashion or to commission portraits that did not flatter them. A few would scandalize their families by marrying for love and not for an alliance. These small gestures were explosive in the world of court politics. In England, some aristocrats would defy expectations by turning to art and literature. Lord Byron did not just write poetry. He lived a life that mocked every expectation of noble restraint. He would cross-dress, travel with his lovers, and he scorned the parliament. His life was a rolling provocation. Less flamboyant nobles would simply vanish to the countryside, retreating from their social obligations in London. That alone could be interpreted as a form of rebellion, a refusal to play the game. In Russia, quiet dissent took on more dangerous forms. Some nobles would support revolutionary ideas while flying under the radar, disguising their radical philosophy salons as harmless poetry gatherings. Others would help serfs to escape or would give them an education, acts that were considered treasonous under the Tsar's rule. These were not loud revolutions, but quiet betrayals of a broken system. Japanese nobles had even subtler means of rebellion: a poorly timed poem, a gift with a hidden insult, or refusing to shave one's head in mourning. All of these could be read as a rejection of ritual. Some noble women would resist their arranged marriages by falling in love through poetry, a subtle yet scandalous act. Others would withdraw into a religious life, not out of piety, but as a form of protest. And then there were those who simply disappeared. There were nobles who would fake an illness to avoid going to court, who would bury themselves in dusty libraries, pretending to be too engrossed in astronomy or botany to deal with the nonsense of the court. Their retreat was not a sign of weakness. It was an act of defiance. These rebels rarely made it into the history books, but their choices, however quiet they were, chipped away at the illusion of perfect obedience. Not all nobles followed the rules. Some of them would whisper, "No," and that, in their world, was louder than any scream. For all their grandeur and posturing, the nobility was obsessed with one thing above all else: legacy. Not the kind that you can feel, but the kind that you can engrave, paint, parade, and pass down. There were portraits in oil, family crests that were etched into marble, and vast estates with names that were longer than some novels. Every ball, every battle, and every betrothal was a part of an unending project to be remembered. But here is the uncomfortable truth: most of them were not. Yes, we remember the monarchs, the kings who launched wars, and the queens who lost their heads. But the average noble? They have been forgotten. Their elaborate rituals, their infighting, their expensive shoes, all of it has vanished like breath on a pane of glass. What remains are just fragments: unsigned letters, crumbling estate walls, and cryptic mentions in old estate ledgers. The grand story of the aristocracy is not one of eternal glory. It is one of selective survival. In France, the revolution did not just end lives. It erased entire bloodlines from memory. Portraits were defaced, and names were banned. The aristocracy, who had been so obsessed with how history would view them, were instead swept away by it. Some of them survived, sure, by changing their names, hiding their jewels in fireplace bricks, or fleeing to foreign courts. But their legacies were not what they had intended them to be. They became cautionary tales, not immortals. England's nobles fared better. They were legally protected, land-rich, and institutionally embedded. Yet even they were not immune to the threat of irrelevance. Once buzzing estates now sit in ruin. Dust covers tapestries that once cost a fortune. And the great names? Many of them have dissolved through scandal, poor marriages, or just the passage of time. A line with no heirs is a legacy with no future. In Japan, the aristocracy was eventually replaced in importance by the military class, the samurai, and the shogunate. The elaborate poetry, the court rankings, the ceremonies, all of it faded away. And though a few families can still trace their roots back to the ancient noble houses, the modern world rarely cares. Even the proudest of names have now become museum labels. And what of those who tried to control the narrative, who commissioned epic biographies, who dictated their memoirs, or who sponsored churches? They, too, are subject to history's selective memory. Often, the real stories, the shame, the secrets, the compromises, only survive in whispers, in footnotes, or in hidden letters. In the end, legacy was the ultimate illusion. The nobles lived their lives in the service of being remembered, yet they were often forgotten entirely. Behind the portraits and the palaces lies a quiet truth. Permanence was never real, only the performance of it was. In the spring of 1900, a curious man in a wide-brimmed hat stood under the sun, staring at a scattering of stones and some half-buried walls. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, historian, and eccentric dreamer. He had come to the island of Crete not just to excavate some ruins, but to chase a ghost. Specifically, the ghost of a civilization that had haunted Greek legends for centuries. A civilization that was so old it had slipped through the cracks of both history and myth. For years, travelers and locals had spoken of strange artifacts that had been surfacing in the hills to the south of Heraklion. There was pottery that was older than that of the Mycenaeans, strange glyphs that no one could read, and ruins that did not quite match any known Greek style. Evans was convinced that these were the traces of a Bronze Age people, older than Homer, older than Athens, who had once ruled the Aegean Sea. Then came the moment that changed everything. On a plot of land that was known as Kefala Hill, Evans and his workers unearthed a massive structure that had been buried beneath centuries of dust and rubble. Walls began to emerge, not of simple huts, but the foundations of rooms, staircases, and corridors. What they were looking at was not a temple or a fortress, but a palace. And it was not just any palace. It was one that was so complex it seemed to have been designed to confuse anyone who walked inside it. It was a labyrinth, perhaps. Evans immediately made the connection. This had to be the Palace of Knossos, the legendary seat of King Minos, the same Minos who, according to myth, had imprisoned the half-man, half-bull Minotaur deep within a maze that lay beneath his home. Whether it was a myth or not, the ruins certainly matched the story. There were countless twisting halls, multiple floors, and mysterious dead ends. It was a palace that defied logic, as if it had been built to trap not just people, but time itself. He called the people who had built it the Minoans, after King Minos. No one knew what they had called themselves. Their script, which is known as Linear A, was still undeciphered. But their art, their architecture, and their reach all suggested that this was a long-forgotten empire. And so, with a trowel in his hand and a myth in his mind, Evans began to peel back the centuries. What he found would go on to challenge everything that people thought they knew about early European civilization, and it would ignite new debates that still have not been settled to this day. The Palace of Knossos is not a palace in the traditional sense. It is more like a puzzle, made of corridors, courts, and chambers that seem to double back on themselves with every turn. Covering more than 150,000 square feet, the structure was a multi-story marvel of the ancient world, and at its heart lay a paradox. How could something that was so open, so light-filled, and so advanced also feel so impossible to map? There were no grand walls or moats, and no militaristic towers. Instead, Knossos had balconies, skylights, and air shafts, architectural features that were unheard of in Bronze Age Europe. The entire complex seemed to have been designed not for war, but for ceremony, administration, and perhaps for mystery. Stairs wound their way in dizzying spirals, narrow corridors would open up into sudden courtyards, and rooms would connect in unexpected ways. Scholars have debated for over a century whether this design was intentional, a symbolic nod to the myth of the labyrinth, or if it was simply the result of centuries of rebuilding. To walk through Knossos is to surrender any sense of direction. There are rooms within rooms, wings that loop into each other, and passageways that lead nowhere at all. Evans was convinced that this layout reflected the story of Daedalus, the legendary craftsman who was said to have constructed the labyrinth for King Minos to imprison the Minotaur. While there is no archaeological proof of a literal monster, the confusion that one feels while navigating the site is very real. And yet, the palace was not just a maze. It was also a miracle of ancient engineering. The complex featured an advanced plumbing system, which included terracotta pipes, flushing toilets, and a drainage system that was so efficient it would have put parts of 19th century Europe to shame. The rooms had natural ventilation, and light wells illuminated the inner chambers. Some of the staircases plunged down 3 or 4 stories, suggesting a deep, tiered structure that was rarely seen before the modern era. The throne room, which is modest by royal standards, lies tucked away deep inside the palace, almost hidden. Its centerpiece is a stone chair that is flanked by frescoes of griffins, and it is surrounded by benches. This was not a place of spectacle, but of controlled ritual. Perhaps here, power was less about dominance and more about illusion, mysticism, or religious awe. Knossos was not built to intimidate. It was built to mystify. Whether you were a traitor, a priestess, or a foreign envoy, one truth was certain. Once you entered, the palace would swallow you whole and make you forget the path you had come from. Though the stone walls of Knossos are now crumbling, its colors still speak to us. Buried beneath volcanic ash and the passage of time, the palace's frescoes have emerged as some of the most vivid, enigmatic, and advanced artworks of the ancient world. Unlike the rigid, militaristic art of the later Greek or Egyptian civilizations, the Minoan frescoes burst with movement, of dancers, dolphins, bulls, and goddesses. They did not just decorate the rooms. They told stories, they hinted at rituals, and they revealed a civilization that seemed to love life, beauty, and rhythm. One of the most iconic images from Knossos is the bull-leaping fresco. It depicts a young figure who is somersaulting over a massive bull in an elegant and impossible arc. Was this a real event, or was it a myth? Historians have been debating it for over a century. Was it a ritualistic sport, a religious offering, or simply a metaphor for taming chaos? Regardless of its meaning, the image captures something essential about Minoan life: a dance with danger, with grace at its core. Elsewhere, the walls bloom with lilies and crocuses, monkeys and birds, spirals and waves. In the Prince of the Lilies fresco, a slender youth with flowing hair and an ornate crown struts with a ceremonial confidence. Though Evans initially identified him as a prince, modern scholars are not so sure. The figure may represent a priest or even a goddess. Gender in Minoan art is fluid, symbolic, and still deeply mysterious. Unlike many other ancient civilizations, the Minoans did not focus their art on their kings, their wars, or their conquests. There are no depictions of battles or of slaves. Instead, there are scenes of celebration, of nature, and of sacred rites. Women are central figures, not in the background, but at the very front and center. There are bare-breasted priestesses with elaborate skirts and coiled hairstyles, who are shown performing rituals. This suggests that women may have held significant, and perhaps even dominant, religious roles. And the colors, the deep reds, blues, and whites, still cling to the plaster after thousands of years, defying the passage of time. The vibrancy of the artwork hints at a society that not only valued aesthetics but also understood their emotional power. These were not just pretty paintings. They were symbols of a cosmic order, of human joy, and of spiritual reverence. In the Palace of Knossos, the walls did not just see history. They sang it in pigment and in pattern. The Minoans painted a world of motion, of mystery, and of meaning. Among the many enigmas of Knossos, one stands out above all the rest: the prominence of women. Unlike many other contemporary societies, where women were confined to the margins, the Minoans placed them at the very center, both literally and symbolically. Their images dominate the frescoes, the figurines, and the ceremonial scenes, hinting at a civilization where female power was not hidden, but was celebrated. In the central court and the sacred chambers of Knossos, there are depictions of bare-breasted women in flounced skirts and ornate headdresses that appear again and again. These were not submissive figures who were tucked away behind their kings. They were at the front and center, with their arms raised in blessing, holding serpents, and surrounded by symbols of fertility, animals, and divine energy. Scholars believe that many of these women were priestesses, who acted as intermediaries between the mortal and the divine, and who were responsible for overseeing the rituals that touched every aspect of Minoan life. One of the most famous artifacts that has been recovered from the palace is the snake goddess figurine, a woman with a piercing gaze who is holding serpents in both of her hands and who has a feline perched on top of her head. Was she a deity? Was she a high priestess? Was she a representation of female sovereignty? We may never know for sure, but her image tells us volumes about the spiritual hierarchy of Knossos and about who may have stood at its peak. In contrast to the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of Mycenae, no clear Minoan male ruler has ever been identified in their art. There is no grand statue of a king, and no battle scenes that glorify a warlord. This has led many scholars to suggest that Minoan society may have been matriarchal, or at least unusually egalitarian for its time. It is likely that women held power in both religion and possibly in governance, guiding the seasonal festivals, managing the temples, and performing the state rituals. Even the architecture of the palace seems to reflect this balance. There are rooms that are believed to have been used by high-ranking women, which have direct access to shrines, light wells, and private staircases. This suggests that they were able to move freely throughout the palace. Some of the frescoes depict women who are gathered in ceremonial processions, who are dressed in vivid garments, and whose posture is commanding, not deferential. At Knossos, femininity was not confined. It was divine. Whether as priestesses, leaders, or symbols of renewal, women were not secondary to Minoan culture. They were the culture, its voice, its vision, and possibly its soul. The Palace of Knossos was not just a royal residence. It was a stage for the sacred. Every corridor, every courtyard, and every chamber seemed to pulse with a spiritual intent. From the underground crypts to the sun-drenched altars, the palace was built not merely for living, but for communing with the divine. And while no Minoan holy book has ever survived, the architecture itself whispers of the rituals that once shaped their world. The palace featured dozens of small shrines and ritual rooms, many of which were tucked away into secluded corners or were carved deep below the ground. These were not places for mass worship. They were intimate, mysterious, and were likely restricted to the priestess elite. One of the chambers, which is often called the lustral basin, features a sunken, tub-like structure at the base of a narrow staircase. It was not meant for bathing, but was likely used for purification rites. Perhaps the initiates would descend in silence, to be cleansed by symbolic waters before they entered the sacred ceremonies. The central court, which is vast and open to the sky, was likely the heart of public ritual. Here, hundreds of people might have gathered for seasonal festivals to celebrate fertility, renewal, or the turning of the year. The rhythmic sound of drums, the twirling of dancers, the chants of the priestesses. Knossos was alive with ceremony, and always present in these rites was the bull, that powerful symbol of energy, of virility, and of the natural world. Throughout the palace, there were bull horns, stylized and massive, that were placed on top of the walls and at the entrances. These horns of consecration, as Evans called them, marked the sacred thresholds. When paired with the bull-leaping imagery that is found in the frescoes, it is clear that this animal held a deep religious meaning. Some believe that a live bull may have even been a part of certain rituals, not in a brutal sacrifice, but as a partner in a spiritual performance that was meant to mirror the eternal dance between chaos and order. The double axe, or labrys, was another symbol that was often associated with the sacred spaces in Knossos. It has been found carved into pillars and walls, and it may have been a tool, a weapon, or a divine emblem. Its frequent pairing with female figures further supports the idea of a goddess-centered religion. There are no temples in the traditional sense at Knossos. Instead, the palace itself was the temple. Every stairwell was a procession, and every chamber was a chapel. It was a place where the spiritual and the political were one, and where sacredness was woven into the very walls of the building. Amidst the frescoes, the altars, and the labyrinthine chambers of Knossos, archaeologists uncovered something that was even more puzzling: writing. They found hundreds of clay tablets that were inscribed with symbols that no one to this day can fully understand. This was Linear A, the script of the Minoans, and it is one of the last great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Discovered during Evans's excavations, Linear A looked superficially similar to another script that had been found in Mycenaean Greece, which is known as Linear B. Evans assumed that the two were related, and they were, but while Linear B was later cracked and was revealed to be an early form of the Greek language, Linear A has stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. It is a language that is unrelated to Greek, and it is possibly unrelated to any other known language on Earth. We can read its characters phonetically, but we do not know what they mean. Most of the Linear A tablets that have been found at Knossos are administrative inventories of grain, oil, livestock, or offerings, but without knowing the language, the context of these tablets remains elusive. Were they records of taxes, ritual offerings, market records? No one can say with any certainty. The Minoans wrote in this script for over 500 years, and yet we still cannot understand a single full sentence of it. This linguistic blackout is what gives Knossos its dreamlike quality. It is like listening to music through a wall. You can sense the rhythm, the energy, and the intent, but the lyrics are forever muffled. We can see their rituals in their art, and we can see their architecture in the stone, but their thoughts remain sealed away from us. Linear A was written with a stylus on soft clay, which was then baked by accident, preserved only because the palace was destroyed by a fire. Without that disaster, their words might have dissolved long ago. Ironically, the burning of Knossos is what gifted us with the only surviving fragments of the Minoan language. Some scholars believe that Linear A might one day be deciphered, especially if any bilingual texts are ever found, much like how the Rosetta Stone was able to crack the code of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until then, we are left with just isolated symbols. A man, a bull, a jar, a sun. All meaningless, and yet all hauntingly familiar. Knossos, for all its color and complexity, speaks to us in silence. Its language sits just beyond our reach, reminding us that some of history's greatest voices are still waiting to be heard, buried not in the earth, but in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, which was once a beacon of art, architecture, and ritual, did not vanish in a single cataclysm. Its fall was not a swift event, but a layered one, a slow unraveling of a civilization whose power had once seemed eternal. And like so many other ancient collapses, the truth behind the downfall of Knossos is a tapestry of fire, water, and the whispers of war. Around 1450 BCE, something changed suddenly across the island of Crete. Minoan palaces and towns began to burn. Curiously, Knossos did not fall immediately. Instead, it was reoccupied, but the style of the frescoes changed. The writing on the clay tablets shifted from Linear A to Linear B, not Minoan, but Mycenaean Greek. This suggests that the Mycenaeans, the rising power from the mainland, had either invaded or had taken control peacefully after some catastrophe had weakened the Minoans. Whatever the method, Knossos was no longer ruled by its native people. One theory points to the eruption of the volcano on Thera, the modern-day island of Santorini, which is just to the north of Crete. This eruption, which occurred around 1600 BCE, was one of the most powerful in recorded history, and it devastated the region with earthquakes and tsunamis. The resulting chaos may have crippled the Minoan economy, wrecked their ports, and weakened their influence, leaving them vulnerable to either an invasion or an internal collapse. Others argue for a more gradual economic and political decline, as trade routes shifted and their rivals grew stronger. The centralized power of Knossos may have fractured. The palace, which was once buzzing with activity, became more administrative and more subdued. Ritual gave way to record-keeping, and art gave way to imitation. By 1375 BCE, the palace was abandoned entirely. Fires raged through its halls, its roofs collapsed, and its walls cracked and buckled. Knossos was left in silence, its colors fading, its language unread, and its rituals forgotten. And yet, it was never truly lost. Legends of the labyrinth and the Minotaur survived in Greek myth, and hints of Minoan influence echoed through the Mycenaean palaces and later, in classical art and architecture. The soul of Knossos lingered on like smoke, invisible but still present. Today, its ruins are open to the sun again. Tourists now walk where priestesses once danced, and the palace that had once held a civilization together now holds its secrets in plain sight. Majestic, mysterious, and unfinished. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered the Palace of Knossos in 1900, he did not just excavate it, he reimagined it. With a mix of scholarly ambition and artistic vision, Evans set out not only to preserve the ruins, but also to bring them back to life. He believed that simply exposing the foundations was not enough. The world needed to see the palace as he believed it had once been, colorful, complex, and awe-inspiring. What followed was one of the most controversial restorations in the history of archaeology. Using concrete, a material that was completely alien to the Bronze Age, Evans rebuilt sections of the palace using modern methods. He employed artists to repaint the frescoes, using the fragments that had been found on the site, but he would often fill in the missing details based on his own assumptions and not on any actual evidence. Balconies were reconstructed and columns were restored, not in their original dull stone, but painted red with black caps, based on Evans's own vision of Minoan aesthetics. Rooms were given roofs, walls were replastered, and the ancient palace slowly became a hybrid, part ruin and part Edwardian fantasy. Some people applauded his boldness. They argued that without Evans, Knossos might have remained just another tangle of unremarkable ruins. His reconstructions made the site accessible, educational, and emotionally compelling. Visitors could now walk through halls that felt alive. They could see murals that were bursting with color, and they could visualize the world of the Minoans with more clarity than ever before. But others saw things differently. Critics accused Evans of overstepping his bounds, of imposing his own interpretation on a civilization that we still barely understand. The frescoes, for instance, were sometimes almost entirely invented, based on just a few small shards of the original paint. Whole sections of the palace, such as the famous throne room, may have been assigned functions that they never actually had. By shaping the ruins to match the myth, Evans may have blurred the line between archaeology and storytelling. Today, Knossos is both a marvel and a monument to the complexities of historical reconstruction. Evans's vision cannot be separated from the site. His concrete structures still stand, and his artistic interpretations still color the walls. But visitors now walk through Knossos with a dual awareness of what the Minoans might have built and of what a passionate archaeologist believed they did. In trying to bring Knossos back to life, Evans may have given us two palaces. One that is ancient and buried in the earth, and one that is imagined, standing boldly above it. Today, the Palace of Knossos stands not only as a ruin but also as a bridge between myth and history, between imagination and evidence, and between Europe and the ancient world. Long after its last ritual was performed and its halls fell silent, Knossos continues to fascinate, to mystify, and to provoke. Its very existence challenges our assumptions about early civilization and forces us to confront how little we still know. The palace helped to redefine the timeline of European history. Before its discovery, most scholars believed that advanced civilization began with the Greeks. Knossos rewrote that narrative. Here was a culture that was flourishing 1,000 years earlier, with plumbing, urban planning, international trade, and symbolic art. The Minoans, who were centered at Knossos, were not primitive. They were sophisticated, expressive, and deeply spiritual. But the legacy of Knossos is inseparable from its mythology. For millennia, the story of the Minotaur in the labyrinth was dismissed as mere fiction, a fable that was meant to either frighten or to entertain. And yet, when archaeologists unearthed a palace with hundreds of rooms, with corridors that looped and twisted, and with symbols of bulls that were carved into the stone, the line between myth and history became blurred. Perhaps the legend was not invented, but was simply remembered, filtered down through the generations until only fragments of it survived. In modern times, Knossos has inspired not just scholars, but also writers, artists, and architects. Its double axes, its horned symbols, and its sinuous frescoes have all appeared in fashion, in sculpture, and even in science fiction. The idea of a hidden ancient civilization that lies beneath the Mediterranean still fuels our imaginations. A vision of a time when power did not mean pyramids or conquest, but beauty, ritual, and balance. Yet, Knossos also reminds us of our own fragility. The palace fell, its language was lost, its people vanished, and its meaning, its real, original purpose, is still being debated. Every interpretation of it is a mirror, reflecting not just the past, but also what we want to believe about it. If you walk its halls today, you will be standing where priestesses once prayed, where dancers once twirled, and where children once laughed. You will be standing at the heart of the oldest palace in Europe, a place that lived between the sunlight and the shadows, between architecture and myth. Knossos may never give up all of its secrets, but in its silence, it still speaks of mystery, of memory, and of the deep, labyrinthine path of civilization itself. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15th, in the year 37 CE, a child of privilege, but also of poison. His lineage was imperial, tangled up in the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled over Rome with both splendor and suspicion. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of the Emperor Caligula, the great-granddaughter of Augustus, and one of the most cunning political players of her time. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was known for his arrogance and his cruelty. It was said that when someone congratulated him on the birth of his son, he muttered, "Nothing could be born from me and Agrippina but something monstrous." Whether that was a prophecy or just a statement of bitterness, only time would tell. At just 2 years old, Nero lost his father, either to dropsy or possibly to poison. In a Rome where alliances were often fatal and ambition was a blood sport, Agrippina now found herself a widow with a child and no real power. But she was patient. She watched as her brother, Caligula, spiraled into tyranny and was eventually murdered by his own guards. She kept quiet as Claudius, the stammering, bookish uncle, was lifted up to wear the purple robe. And then she made her move. By the year 49 CE, Agrippina had seduced the Emperor Claudius, who was her own uncle, and she had married him. She was not subtle about her goals. Within a year, she had convinced him to adopt her son as his heir, passing over his own biological son, Britannicus. Lucius was renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, a name that was fit for an emperor. She arranged his engagement to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, and she hired Rome's finest tutors to mold him. Chief among them was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who tried to shape the young man into a noble ruler. From the outside, Nero was being groomed for greatness. He was educated in rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and music. He learned how to command a crowd, how to recite Homer, and how to manipulate public opinion. But Agrippina still held the reins. She would appear beside him in ceremonies, she would order his household, and she made it clear who it was that truly wielded the power. Nero's rise to power was not born from destiny. It was engineered by a mother who had seen herself as an empress long before her son ever wore a crown. And within that gilded nursery of ambition and manipulation, the seeds of a chaotic reign were quietly being planted. In the year 54 CE, at just 16 years of age, Nero became the emperor of Rome. Claudius, his adoptive father, had died, officially from an illness, though many people suspected that he had been poisoned. And the prime suspect was Agrippina. She had long grown impatient with waiting, and when Claudius began to reconsider his own biological son, Britannicus, as his heir, she acted. Legend has it that the method of delivery was mushrooms, the food of the gods, as some people joked darkly, and perhaps also the food of murder. With Claudius now dead, Nero was rushed into power. The Roman Senate approved, the Praetorian Guard applauded, and Agrippina stood triumphantly behind him, dressed in gold and flanked by her guards, the real architect of the new regime. But she had not raised an emperor. She had built a puppet. In the early months of Nero's reign, Rome prospered. He gave generous bonuses to the soldiers, he held public games, and he promised a return to the values of the Augustan era. Behind the scenes, the governance of the empire was being handled by two key figures: Seneca, the philosopher and tutor who had now turned into a speechwriter, and Burrus, the pragmatic head of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they steered Nero through the complex decisions of state while maintaining a veneer of noble restraint. But Agrippina was not content to stay in the wings. She expected to rule alongside her son. And when Nero began to assert his independence, the tensions between them exploded. At first, their battles were subtle. She demanded to appear on coins beside Nero's own image, something that no Roman mother had ever done before. She would intrude on state meetings. She once walked into the Senate chamber uninvited, and she would constantly remind Nero of who it was that had made him the emperor. The young emperor began to chafe under her control. He started to surround himself with his own advisors, men of pleasure and of art, not of duty. He fell in love with a woman named Act, who was a former slave girl, much to Agrippina's horror. She had had plans for a royal marriage for him, not a romance with a commoner. The once close bond between the mother and her son began to sour. Whispers began to spread throughout the palace of shouting matches, of slammed doors, and of veiled threats. Agrippina, who had once been revered as the empress maker, now seemed to be a looming threat. Rome had given Nero a throne, but Agrippina still held the leash, and Nero was beginning to reach for the knife. His reign had begun with promise, with poetry, and with applause, but behind the curtain, a family tragedy was already brewing, one that would go on to stain the imperial purple with blood. By the year 59 CE, the imperial palace had turned into a battlefield, not of armies, but of wills. Nero was the emperor in name, but his mother, Agrippina, still loomed like a storm cloud over every decision he made. She would undermine his authority, she would oppose his personal life, and she would plot in the shadows to have him replaced with Britannicus, the late Emperor Claudius's biological son. Nero, who had once been an obedient boy with a tutor, had now become a young man who was desperate to escape from his mother's grasp. He acted first. Britannicus, who was a legitimate threat to Nero's throne, suddenly died during a banquet. The guests claimed that he had choked on his wine, but the poison was so fast-acting that his death was unmistakable. Nero denied any involvement, but few people believed him, and Agrippina certainly did not. With Britannicus now gone, Nero's next problem was his own mother. She had once ruled through him, but now he saw her as a rival. Agrippina was not just politically ambitious. She was relentless. She would meet with senators in secret. She would parade around noblemen who she hoped to position as her son's replacements. She would make veiled threats about the loyalties of the Praetorian Guard. And worst of all, for Nero, the people still loved her. Rome admired strong women, as long as they were not too strong. Agrippina had crossed that line. Nero first tried to exile her. He stripped her of her bodyguards. He removed her from all public appearances, and he sent her to live in a coastal villa. But the distance did not silence her. She still corresponded, she still whispered, and she still pulled the strings. So Nero made a darker choice. He invited Agrippina to a grand celebration, and he gifted her a lavish boat for her return voyage. The vessel had been rigged to collapse in the middle of the sea. But when the sabotaged ship broke apart, Agrippina survived, swimming to the shore under the moonlight. The botched attempt on her life enraged and humiliated Nero, so he tried again. This time, he sent assassins to her villa under the pretense of delivering an urgent message. The accounts of what happened next vary, but one story says that she faced her killers calmly, telling them to strike her in the womb, the very place that had given birth to Nero. Her murder sent shockwaves throughout the empire. Nero's guilt was immediate and all-consuming. He could not sleep, he would pace at night, and he claimed to see her ghost in the halls of the palace. Rome, too, whispered of the unthinkable crime, the emperor who had killed his own mother. With Agrippina's death, Nero had finally broken free, but in doing so, he had also severed his last tether to any form of restraint. What followed would be a reign that was untethered by shame and that was spiraling down toward infamy. With Agrippina now gone, Nero was finally the emperor in full. There were no more whispers, no more maternal oversight, just unfiltered power. But instead of channeling that power into military conquests or administrative reforms, Nero turned inward. He did not want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be adored as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, and an actor. He would perform in public, something that no Roman emperor had ever dared to do before. To the Senate and the aristocracy, it was mortifying. In Roman tradition, The stage was reserved for slaves and for foreigners. But Nero was undeterred. He trained in music and in drama. He demanded applause, and he would fill the amphitheaters with forcibly enthusiastic audiences. The emperor did not just host the games. He starred in them. Nero would compose verses, he would sing tragic arias, and he would recite long epics of his own creation. He prided himself on his voice, and he even underwent strange treatments to preserve it, which included vomiting rituals, long periods of silence, and bizarre diets. Senators would sit through hours-long performances, terrified to leave their seats. Not clapping could mean exile or worse. He also threw vast resources into building theaters, into sponsoring athletic contests, and into redesigning the city of Rome to reflect his own aesthetic tastes. He introduced Greek-style games like the Neronia, which was a blend of Olympic sports and theatrical competitions, and in which, unsurprisingly, Nero always won the first prize. His obsession with performance even spilled over into his foreign policy. On a trip to Greece, Nero insisted on competing in every artistic contest at the Olympic Games. He took part in a chariot race with 10 horses instead of the standard 4. He fell off his chariot in the middle of the race, but he was still declared the victor. Why? Because, in Nero's eyes, he would have won if he had not fallen, a clear triumph. Yet, even as he was indulging in these creative fantasies, the empire was groaning under the strain. Administrators were being neglected, governors were acting without any oversight, and the provinces were growing restless. But Nero did not care. He was not trying to be another Augustus or another Tiberius. He wanted to be Orpheus or Apollo or maybe something even greater, a god of music who held absolute power. To the Roman elite, he was becoming a national embarrassment, but to the masses, who were given bread, games, and endless entertainment, Nero was a living spectacle. A flawed god on a stage who was singing over the cracks in his collapsing empire. In July of the year 64 CE, a fire ignited near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, the flames were surging through the city like a divine curse. The streets of Rome, which were narrow, overcrowded, and highly flammable, became a furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights, the capital of the empire burned. By the end of it, 10 of the city's 14 districts had been reduced to rubble. Thousands of people were left homeless. Temples, homes, and marketplaces were all gone. And where was the emperor? The rumors began to fly. Some people claimed that Nero had watched the blaze from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing of the destruction of Troy. Others swore that he had ordered the fire himself, just to make room for a new palace. Nero denied both of these claims, and in truth, he was not even in Rome when the fire had begun. But when he returned, he acted with a theatrical flair. He opened up his private gardens to the refugees, he organized emergency food deliveries, and he funded the reconstruction of the city. Yet the whispers persisted. The people needed a scapegoat, and Nero, ever the dramatist, gave them one. He blamed the Christians. They were already a mistrusted group, a strange sect of Jews who worshipped a crucified man and who refused to honor the Roman gods. Nero accused them of arson, and he began a persecution that was so brutal it would echo down through the centuries. Christians were torn apart by dogs, they were crucified, and most horrifyingly, they were burned alive to serve as torches for Nero's garden parties. It was not justice, it was theater by firelight. Meanwhile, Nero unveiled his true ambition, the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. On the ashes of central Rome, he began to construct a pleasure palace of unimaginable extravagance, with artificial lakes, gilded walls, revolving dining rooms, and ceilings that would sprinkle down perfume. It was a monument to his own indulgence. A colossal statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, was planned to tower over it all. To many Romans, this just confirmed their suspicions. Nero had not just let the city burn. He had used the fire as a blank canvas. He had erased the old Rome to paint a new one, with himself as the star. But Nero saw things differently. In his mind, he was not destroying. He was creating. He was remaking Rome in his own image, dramatic, divine, and unforgettable. But in trying to immortalize himself through art and architecture, Nero had scorched the earth and had lit the fuse of his own downfall. As Nero's reign dragged on, the applause began to fade, and fear took its place. The emperor who had once danced across the stage now paced the palace corridors in a state of growing paranoia. He saw enemies in every shadow and conspiracies in every whisper. The artist emperor had become a tyrant in a mask of grease paint. Following the Great Fire and the unpopular construction of his golden house, Nero's standing with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. The aristocracy, who were already offended by his performances and his extravagance, now began to fear for their lives. In the year 65 CE, a plot was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, in which dozens of senators, equestrians, and even soldiers were implicated in a scheme to overthrow him. Some of them wanted to restore the Republic, while others simply wanted anyone but Nero on the throne. Nero's response was swift and ruthless. The poet Lucan, the philosopher Seneca, and the general Fenius Rufus were all ordered to commit suicide. Seneca, who had been Nero's former tutor and once his moral compass, was forced to slit his wrists while calmly discussing Stoic philosophy. Even those who were only rumored to be sympathetic to the plot were swept up in the purges. The palace became a house of executions, and the Senate chamber, a silent theater of obedience. The emperor's paranoia deepened. He accused his own wife, Octavia, of infidelity, a charge that was so flimsy it insulted the intelligence of even his closest allies. She was exiled and then executed. Her head was then sent to his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, as a twisted token of his affection. But even Poppaea was not safe. During a fit of rage or possibly a drunken argument, Nero kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant. She died soon after. Some say that he wept for days, while others claim that he mourned the loss of his muse, not the woman herself. Poison became a regular tool in his arsenal. He would rely on the infamous poisoner, Locusta, a woman whose concoctions had killed emperors and rivals alike. At Nero's command, she even trained others, creating a small and macabre academy of assassination. By now, Nero's court resembled a stage that was soaked in blood. Every friend was a suspect, and every ally was a potential betrayer. And through it all, Nero continued to sing, to perform, and to believe that he was loved. But his audience was shrinking, their laughter was nervous, and the knives were getting closer. While Nero was indulging in his performances and his purges in Rome, the empire beyond the capital began to rumble. The provinces, which had long been the backbone of Rome's power, were growing restless under the weight of neglect, extortion, and Nero's increasingly erratic rule. Taxes were high, the governors were corrupt, and the military's prestige had eroded. In the distant corners of the empire, people's patience was wearing thin, and rebellion was beginning to stir. The first crack came from the east. In the year 66 CE, the province of Judea erupted into a full-scale revolt. Tensions between the Roman authorities and the Jewish population had been simmering for years, fueled by religious oppression and heavy taxation. When Nero's appointed governors desecrated their sacred temples and looted their treasuries, open war broke out. This was the beginning of the First Jewish-Roman War, and it would go on to cost Rome dearly. Nero dispatched one of his most competent generals, Vespasian, to crush the rebellion, an act that, ironically, would later prove to be fatal to Nero's own reign. Meanwhile, in the west, the storm clouds were gathering even darker. In Gaul and in Spain, the Roman legions began to murmur their discontent. Nero's lavish lifestyle, the destruction of Rome, and his cruelty had all eroded the loyalty of both the aristocrats and the soldiers. In the year 68 CE, governors like Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul declared an open rebellion, accusing Nero of being a disgrace to Rome, a self-absorbed performer who was unworthy of wearing the purple. Vindex's rebellion failed militarily, but it succeeded politically as it emboldened others. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the powerful governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, refused to recognize Nero's authority and declared himself a legatus of the Senate and the people of Rome. It was the first open call for a regime change. Back in Rome, panic began to take hold. Nero's supporters started to flee or to turn against him. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, grew bolder. The Praetorian Guard, who had once been his fiercest protectors, were now being bribed by Galba's agents. Their loyalty, like everything else in Nero's court, was transactional. Nero tried to rally support. He wept, he begged, and he even considered fleeing to the eastern provinces and returning as a popular artist. But it was too late. The empire had turned against its self-declared god performer. Nero's isolation was now complete. The provinces that had once cheered his rise to power now lit the fuse of his destruction. The emperor had lost his stage, and now the curtain was falling. By June of the year 68 CE, Nero was the emperor in name only. The Senate had turned against him, and the Praetorian Guard, who had once been the iron wall around his throne, had declared their allegiance to Galba. The people of Rome, who had once been entertained by his games and his theatrics, now watched in silence as the city held its breath. The empire that Nero had once tried to turn into his own personal stage had now left him without an audience. When Nero awoke on the morning of June 9th, messengers brought him the news that sealed his fate. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. He was to be arrested and executed by the traditional Roman method, the pena culei, which involved being beaten to death while naked, with his head clamped in a forked stick. The same man who had once performed to adoring crowds would now die, humiliated and alone. Panicked, Nero fled from Rome in disguise, dressed in rags and accompanied by a few of his loyal freedmen. They took refuge in the villa of his former secretary, which was located in the countryside just outside the city. There, in a dark and overgrown garden, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors hid in a ditch, listening for the sound of approaching horsemen. Even in his final hours, Nero's obsession with his own legacy did not fade. When he heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, he reportedly cried out, "What an artist dies in me!" It was not Rome that he was mourning, but himself, his talent, his image, and his own tragic ending. His companions urged him to die by his own hand, but he hesitated. For all of his brutality, Nero was a coward when it came to his own death. Finally, as the soldiers drew near, he pressed a dagger to his throat, with the help of a freedman named Epaphroditus. The blade pierced his flesh, but he did not die immediately. As the blood filled his lungs, he whispered, "Too late, this is fidelity." He was 30 years old. The soldiers were astonished to find his dying body. The Senate, which was now under the control of Galba, ordered that he be buried in a simple grave. There was to be no state funeral, no divine honors, just a quiet end to a chaotic reign. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius, was extinguished. What followed was a new storm: civil war, chaos, and the rapid rise and fall of new emperors. But one thing was clear: Rome would never forget Nero. Nero's body was barely cold before the legends about him began to bloom. Some Romans rejoiced, others mourned, and still more whispered that he was not really dead, that he had escaped to the east and would one day return. Over the next few decades, no fewer than 3 impostors would claim to be the resurrected Nero, appearing in Asia Minor with lyres in their hands and songs on their lips. The myth of Nero, it seemed, had only just begun. For many in the Roman elite, his legacy was clear. Nero was a monster, a megalomaniac who had murdered his own mother, had burned his own capital, and had disgraced the empire with his narcissistic performances. The historians who chronicled his life, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, all painted him as a cautionary tale. The artist emperor who had let his vanity devour his virtue. And yet, not everyone agreed. Among the lower classes, Nero remained oddly beloved. He had reduced their taxes, he had built public baths, and he had organized massive games and grain distributions. He had given Rome its greatest spectacles. Some even considered him to be a populist, vulgar, yes, but also generous. Centuries later, Christian texts would demonize him even further, with early writers labeling Nero as the first Antichrist, and possibly even the beast of Revelation. He was remembered not just as a bad ruler, but as a cosmic villain. Still, there was something magnetic about Nero's story. He was not the calculating tyrant that Tiberius or Caligula had been. He was theatrical, flamboyant, impulsive, and often absurd. He had ruled like a man who was in a permanent dream, casting himself as a poet, a god, and a tragic hero all at once. Even his death felt like a scene from a lost Greek tragedy. In later centuries, artists, playwrights, and filmmakers would resurrect Nero as a symbol of fallen grandeur, a ruler who was too obsessed with beauty to bear the ugliness of power. His name became a shorthand for excess and for decline, a lesson in what happens when one's ego eclipses an empire. But perhaps Nero's strangest legacy is this: he made power itself performative. He understood, centuries before the age of mass media, that one's image could be as strong as one's policy, that if you could control the narrative, you could shape how the future would remember you. And in that sense, he got what he wanted. 2,000 years later, we still remember Nero, not for ruling Rome, but for burning his name onto the stage of history. Courtiers would gamble enormous sums of money, not just at cards, but on horses, land speculation, and high-stakes alliances. Many nobles would mortgage their ancestral estates just to fund one more season of social relevance. And the king did not help matters. Louis XIV, in particular, kept the nobles close, not just physically but also economically. He encouraged extravagant spending at court to keep them dependent, distracted, and loyal. A ruined noble was a controllable noble. In England, the aristocracy was not much better off. During the Georgian era, lords and ladies often lived in opulent townhouses in London that were financed entirely on credit. Tailors, wine merchants, and milliners were expected to wait for months, and sometimes even years, for payment. Entire families were balanced on the edge of collapse, hoping that their daughter would marry a wealthier man or that some distant cousin would die and leave them a title and a working estate. Meanwhile, in Russia, the nobles were granted vast lands that were populated by serfs, and yet many of them were still cash poor. Their wealth was illiquid, so their lavish lifestyles in Moscow required constant borrowing. Pawn shops would discreetly handle tiaras and sabers. Family jewels were sold under candlelight behind locked doors. Japan's noble class fared no better. During periods of peace, as the samurai class shifted from being warriors to bureaucrats during the Tokugawa era, many nobles found themselves to be ceremonial but ultimately irrelevant. Their stipends shrank, but their costs remained the same. Some even took on side jobs, yes, actual jobs, in poetry schools or in estate management just to keep up appearances. But admitting to financial hardship was considered a dishonor, so their debts would pile up in secret. The lesson here is that nobility was not about financial stability. It was about the performance of wealth, and often, that performance came at a soul-crushing cost. Scandal was the unofficial second language of the nobility. There were affairs, jewels, secret children, and whispered betrayals. The more polished the public image, the dirtier the private truths. The nobles had power, prestige, and privilege, but what many of them did not have was restraint. At Versailles, the courtiers lived in such close quarters that privacy was nearly non-existent, and yet illicit liaisons flourished. Queen Marie Antoinette was endlessly accused of romantic entanglements, whether with Swedish nobles or with members of her inner circle of ladies. Many of these rumors were false, but they stuck because everyone knew someone who was doing exactly that. The court practically ran on gossip, and scandal was not just tolerated. It was a form of currency. Having your name mentioned in connection with someone else's bedroom could either elevate your influence or ruin your bloodline. Meanwhile, over in England, aristocratic reputations were being shredded in salons and gambling houses. Lord Byron, for example, was rumored to have fathered children with his own half-sister. That did not stop him from being a celebrity, but it did cast a long shadow over his noble status. Nobles were expected to have mistresses, just not too many of them, and definitely not the wrong ones. Affairs with actresses, commoners, or foreign spies could lead to exile, imprisonment, or in rare cases, an early grave. In Imperial Russia, the court of Catherine the Great was notorious for its openness. The Empress herself had lovers throughout her reign, who were often handpicked and elevated to positions of power. But it was not just Catherine. Her courtiers were constantly engaged in intrigues, often mixing political maneuvering with bedroom games. Affairs were less about love and more about leverage. Even in the refined Heian court of Japan, where restraint and poetry reigned, scandal found its way through haikus and love letters. A noblewoman might receive a midnight visitor whose identity she would never reveal, but her next poem, which would be shared among the elite, might offer just enough of a metaphor to ignite a wildfire of speculation. The most dangerous scandals, though, were the ones that never made it into letters or court whispers, the ones that involved treason, espionage, and the betrayal of blood. These were whispered in corridors, documented in coded correspondence, and buried in family archives. In the life of a noble, scandal was not the exception. It was the wallpaper, beautiful, intricate, and always hiding the cracks underneath. For all their earthly power and luxury, the nobles were often tormented by a far less visible force, the crushing weight of spiritual uncertainty. They had everything, and yet they still wrestled with existential dread. Being born into privilege did not grant them any clarity about the afterlife, morality, or their divine purpose. In fact, it often made things worse. In Catholic France, guilt clung to the corridors of the palaces like smoke. The same nobles who attended Mass daily might also indulge in debauchery every night. Confession was a routine practice, but it was often more for social performance than for true penitence. Still, many nobles, especially as they grew older, were haunted by their sins. Some would turn to mystics and visionaries, desperate for answers. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, grew more devout in his final years, racked with fear over his worldly indulgences and the wars he had waged across Europe. The nobles would fund the building of churches and monasteries, not just out of piety, but also as a form of insurance. In their minds, a new chapel might buy them a cleaner conscience, and 1,000 candles lit in their name could offset a lifetime of intrigue and excess. Some would retreat into a monastic life altogether in their old age, swapping their velvet robes for hair shirts. In Orthodox Russia, things were even more intense. The nobles were expected to uphold both the political and the spiritual order, yet many of them wrestled with doubt, especially during the turbulent reigns of the Tsars, who would declare themselves to be chosen by God even as they were ordering purges. Some nobles sought answers in secret prayer circles or turned to the fools for Christ, holy wanderers who had renounced wealth and comfort to speak uncomfortable truths. These odd mystics sometimes served as the only outlet for aristocrats who were facing a spiritual crisis. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, the samurai nobility, a hybrid class, often found themselves torn between Confucian ethics, Shinto rituals, and Buddhist detachment. Some nobles would turn to Zen, hoping that meditation would silence their inner turmoil. Others would compose poetry, not just for the sake of art, but as a form of spiritual catharsis. Still, the tension between duty, honor, and the impermanence of life gnawed at them. When a noble committed seppuku, it was not always about shame. Sometimes it was about achieving a spiritual release. Despite their silks and their titles, the nobles were often profoundly lost. Surrounded by ritual and grandeur, many of them still stared into the void, wondering if any of it truly mattered. Behind the masks of their status, their souls were whispering, and sometimes screaming, for peace. In the age before smartphones and email, the most dangerous thing a noble could send was not an assassin. It was a letter. A simple piece of ink on parchment could undo a dynasty, expose an affair, or spark a revolution. And the nobles, despite their outward elegance, were compulsive correspondents. They wrote everything down. Their secrets, their longings, their schemes, their prayers, their loves, and their lies. These were not idle pen-pal exchanges. They were calculated tools of diplomacy and survival. At Versailles, every noble had a paper trail. Love letters to their mistresses, pleas to their creditors, and carefully worded flatteries to the king. And not all of it was above board. Couriers would carry sealed notes that were laced with invisible ink or written in cipher. A single wrong phrase in the wrong hands could lead to exile or even the scaffold. Some nobles even had their own personal ciphers, alphabets that were invented solely for their clandestine conversations. The Duke of Orleans, for instance, was known to correspond with suspected radicals in the lead-up to the French Revolution, and his letters were meticulously coded. But ciphers were never foolproof. In one legendary case, A noble's encrypted diary was decoded long after his death, revealing a hidden life of treason and betrayal. In the Habsburg courts, marriage negotiations would often play out through the use of veiled language. A letter might begin with a discussion of the weather and falconry, but it would hide deeper intentions between the lines. Parents would arrange matches through polite lies, and lovers would beg for elopement under the guise of visiting their countryside estates. In Japan's Heian era, poetry served as a form of code. A single waka, which was just 31 syllables long, could convey a message of forbidden love, rejection, or a secret rendezvous. Noble women were particularly skilled at crafting verses with double meanings, and they would often respond in kind within a matter of hours. These exchanges were delivered by discreet messengers, who were sometimes servants or even children, and they were always sworn to silence. During the Renaissance, some noble women ran entire espionage networks through their salons, writing to their allies in foreign courts. In Russia, letters that were smuggled out of the Tsar's inner circle helped to fuel uprisings. Nobles who were trapped in their gilded cages turned to correspondence as their only form of rebellion. Paper became a weapon, a shield, and a confession booth, all in one. Of course, the riskiest letters were the ones that never arrived, those that were intercepted, burned, or buried. Some lay hidden in attics and wall crevices for centuries, their secrets unread and their senders long forgotten. But make no mistake, within those ink-stained lines lived revolutions, heartbreak, and the rawest truths of the noble soul. In noble society, emotion was a luxury that no one could afford. Joy, anger, and fear,